The wind scraped across the Texas plains like a dying breath when Grace Holloway pulled her starving daughter close, hiding beneath the wreckage of a broken wagon. 5 days without food had hollowed her cheeks and stolen the last of her strength. When hoofbeats approached, she braced for danger, drifters, thieves, worse. Instead, a tall rancher dismounted, mud-soaked and steady, his eyes soft with concern. Without a word, he unwrapped the last of his bread and placed it in her trembling hands. In that moment, Grace felt something she hadn't known in months: safety, and the beginning of a new name. Before we ride deeper into the story, if the spirit of the old frontier still stirs your heart, the campfire tales, the courage, the dust, and the honor, then saddle up with us. Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you'll never miss another ride through the legends of the Wild West. Now, let's get back to the trail. The wound of hunger had hollowed Grace Holloway into someone who moved like a shadow, and when the rancher unwrapped that half loaf and offered it with quiet hands, she took it as if taking a prayer, tearing off a small piece and pressing it first into Hazel's fingers. The child chewed slowly, eyes wet with gratitude and exhaustion, and Grace felt her own jaw unclench just enough to breathe. But the old hunger that lived in fear did not leave with the bread. She watched the man's face, the short beard, the pale scar beneath the cheekbone, the way his boots sank into the mud, and every small kindness raised questions like birds at dusk. Royce Banner shrugged off the rain like a man shedding a bad memory and said, simply, "There's a dry roof 5 miles west, a stove that'll burn, and a barn that don't leak." And when Grace whispered that she had nothing to pay with, he shook his head as if the notion itself were a poor joke. "I don't take pay for what ought to be done," he said, and the sentence landed in the stale. Rain pressed air between them with the steady weight of someone used to settling accounts by deed not coin. Grace wanted to ask about motives, to test his patience, to find the moment where the kindness turned into demand. But Hazel's cough, dry, hacking, small and terrible, pulled the rest of her courage into the open like a net. She accepted Royce's offer because a mother's choices are often measured in the distance between a child's breath and the last spark of a fire. The wagon sagged with waterlogged wood as Royce hitched his mule in motion for them to follow. Grace climbed down careful, every movement an accounting of how much trust she could afford, and felt the rasp of other questions along the way. How far had he seen her? Had he known she ran? Would his neighbors be a shelter or a jury? The cabin he led them to was modest and honest, logs fitted with the sort of craftsmanship born of necessity, and the stove's mouth glowed like a single eye that had not yet judged them. Inside, the air smelled of ash and dried apples, and there was a spare bed and a chair in the sort of silence that listened. Royce set his hat on the table without ceremony and said, "You can take the bed. I'll sleep in the barn." And the offer struck Grace like an implausible promise. Men who offered beds sometimes expected more than a warm body in return. But Royce's shoulders were steady, the line of his mouth unclenched, and the small things he did after, stacking a few more logs near the stove, pushing a blanket closer to the child's feet, bringing in a pail of warm water, spoke in a language that had no immediate barter. Grace folded herself into the narrow bed with Hazel curled at her side, the quilt smelling faintly of lavender and horses, and watched Royce through the doorway as he moved to the barn, his silhouette a slow ritual of chores and care. She wanted to believe that his kindness was simply kindness, but the world had taught her to weigh every good deed against the cost. And in the back of her mind bruises of old memory pulsed when she thought of Reuben, of men who smiled in church pews while they planned to hand over a widow's land. Yet as the fire burned and Hazel's breathing evened, something in Grace loosened. The muscles that had held her like an armor softened, not yet trust but parity, a shared human allowance that said tonight we will be warm and tomorrow we will reckon with what follows. Royce did not press for her story. He left space as if respect were its own kind of generosity, and Grace, exhausted, watched the steam rise from her cup of water and felt for a moment that this patch of roof might be enough to let her heart rest just long enough to hear the mule's soft stamping and the wind on the cottonwoods. And she folded that small relief into her hands like the bread she'd been given, grateful, guarded, and willing, for Hazel's sake, to chance an aim on a stranger's promise. Night fell like a hush over the Banner Ranch. The sky pulled tight and black and the cottonwoods along the ridge whispered like old women trading secrets. And Royce moved through that hush with the quiet of a man whose life was measured in chars rather than promises. He stacked wood, checked the harnesses, ran a calloused thumb along the lip of a feed trough as if feeling for the weather inside the grain, and every motion held the simple competence of someone who knew how to keep a place from falling apart. Grace watched him from the cabin doorway, lamplight throwing a thin halo around her tired face, and for a long time she simply watched, because watching was how you learned the shape of a stranger's goodness, or its rub wood might bite you. Hazel slept wrapped in quilts that smelled faintly of hay and lavender. Her cough finally eased to a whisper, and that soft, steady breathing was a miracle small enough to be almost fragile. Grace held both hands to her chest as if cupping the sound could keep it from leaving. Royce had been plain in his offer: take the bed, sleep in the barn, and when he said it there was no flourish, no expectation of repayment with coin or favors, only the kind of plain speech frontiermen used when they meant exactly what they said. The offer, Grace realized, was a kind of currency she had long ago forgotten, a man's word. He did not wait for thanks. Instead, he set about preparing the barn the way one prepares a promise. By making it solid, he swept, he laid fresh straw, he checked the latch on the tack room, and he moved with an economy of steps that kept sound low so as not to disturb the sleeping child. Once, he paused and looked toward the small window where Grace sat and gave a small, almost imperceptible tip of his head, not a call for confidences but a gesture that said, "I'm here," plainly and without condition. Grace wanted to interrogate him, about his travels, about whether he had family, about whether he had handed out bread to others before and taken names from them afterward, because habits built from fear are hard to unmake. But the questions lived like little stones in her throat, heavy and likely to hurt whether swallowed or spat out. Instead, she watched the man tend the horses, watched the way his shoulders eased when Amir answered his murmur and the way he straightened the saddle with hands that had been shaped by rope and repair. Each small act read by her as if it were script, each small kindness a line that might make sense of his character. He left a tin cup of warm water by the threshold of the sleeping room and did not come inside to sit with them. That small courtesy, warm water left where she could find it without lighting a lamp, spoke to Grace louder than any speech, for it was the kind of thought that presumes comfort without demanding thanks. Hazel stirred once in the night and then fell again into easy sleep, and Grace smoothed the child's hair until her fingers ached with the suddenness of relief that felt almost wrong after months on the road. Out beyond the porch, Royce took a slow, deliberate walk around the perimeter, feeling posts and fence rails for the weather's bite, and every now and then the barn's shadows swallowed him whole so that for a moment he was nothing but a silhouette against the stars. Then he would reappear, give one more look back, and return to his watch. The barn itself smelled of hay, leather, and an undertone of horse warmth that made the room feel less like a shelter and more like a home being built out of necessity. Royce hummed an old, low tune as he moved, a private melody that could have been a prayer or simply the muscle memory of a life lived with responsibility. Grace listened and felt the tightness around her chest loosen by degrees, not all the way, not yet, because the world had taught her to keep a ledger of debts owed and debts feared, but enough that she could let herself rest in the small pocket of safety while the night did its honest work of bringing cold and then, in time, light. She did not tell him her story that night. She folded it back into the small, guarded place inside and let the truth breathe only enough to survive. Royce did not ask for details, and that omission became a kind of mercy. He kept the night with the animals, his vigil not noisy but steady, and in the morning when he came back to the cabin, wet coat hung to drip. There was no lecture, no claim, only a breakfast put down without fanfare and a tacit fact of a roof shared. Hazel woke to the smell of coffee and bread, and for the first day in many she laughed while brushing her hair. And Grace, watching the child and the man who had given them this single safe night, felt a thin, honest thing grow inside her, something that could one day be called trust if it were tended with the same patient hands Royce used on the fences. Dawn uncoiled slow and careful over the banner place, and Grace woke to a small miracle. Hazel's sleeve, which the night before had hung in ragged threads from where some cottage had torn it, now lay whole and stitched, the seam uneven but secure, and the little girl slept with one fist curled beneath her cheek as if she trusted the world enough to set her face soft against it. Grace ran her thumb along the crooked line of thread and felt, absurdly, as if she were reading a message spelled out in clumsy knots, the kind of message a man not given to words might write with needle and thread, and for the first time since Missouri she let a true breath out that did not tremble. Royce stood outside at the woodpile when she came to the door, the morning air cooling his coat, and he lifted his hat with a shy, plain courtesy of a man who did not expect thanks for what he had done. There was no swagger in him, only the steady set of shoulders that had learned to carry more than their share. She set a kettle over the oven, hands working through a dull, domestic choreography that felt foreign and salvational all at once. She washed a cup, sliced a bit of the remaining bread, practiced with a certain old skill, and the small, honest routine calmed her as if each motion sold the fraying edges of her life a degree firmer. Royce helped without standing in the room like someone demanding attention. He moved around her in the quiet of a house, learning its sounds, bringing a pail of fresh water, setting a second plate without a question. And when Hazel woke and blinked at the breakfast spread, she smiled with a light that had not been seen in months and reached for Royce's hand as if the gesture were as natural as the dawn. The meal itself was modest, a skillet of eggs, thin slices of coffee, darkened bread, a smear of preserves. But to them it tasted like abundance because hunger had made everything precious. And as Hazel chewed with wide, earnest eyes, Grace watched Royce watch the child and felt something unnameable and warm push at the tightness around her ribs. There was a pause between them like held breath, and then Royce sat, quiet and a little embarrassed, taking what she offered without ceremony and eating like a man who honored whatever work had made the plate possible. Grace had a tendency toward suspicion. A life on the road taught you how to read the posture of men as if they were pages in an account book, but in silence that morning read differently. Not the shut door of a man hiding truth, but the neat, respectful reserve of someone who believed that kindness did not need to be explained. Later, while Hazel chased a butterfly along the fence line and Grace fetched water at the pump, Royce worked in the barn and then, when he thought she might not see, went into the tack room and brought out a bundle of old shirts and a length of new twine knit from a neighbor's mending. He carried them in like a man ashamed of being caught doing something tender, and left them folded atop the table so she would find them when she returned. Grace found, too, a small note tucked beneath his shirts, only 2 words in a hand that was square and unadorned, for Hazel. It was not much, but it was the kind of thing the heart keeps. She wanted to ask where he learned to mend, whether he had done it for his own kin, whether he had ever stood watch over a woman and a child without wanting something in return. But each question felt like a trap that might crack the fragile trust forming between them. So she folded the paper into her pocket instead and carried it quiet with her like an ember. Over the next days the house gathered small kindnesses the way a field gathers wildflowers. Royce left extra firewood stacked close, fixed a leaky hinge without pronouncement, and once came in at dusk carrying a small jar of peaches he had bartered for with the neighbor. His gestures were imperfect and human. He mended with uneven stitches. He forgot to wipe his boots sometimes, but each was deliberate and plainly meant. Grace found herself returning favors in small ways. She straightened a ledger page, scrubbed the table until it shone, taught Hazel to make a soft corner in her bread so the jam would not spill. These were not debts but exchanges that smoothed the edges of 2 lives finding purchase beside one hearth. In that softened light, she realized the truth of what Royce had given them. More than a loaf or a roof, it was the beginning of a safe place to land. And for Hazel's sake, and with a caution that had learned to respect its own wounds, Grace allowed herself to accept it. Morning came like a promise kept, pale and white across the banner yard, and Royce brought Hazel a handful of oats as if giving her a secret. The mare lowered her head and the child's small hand trembled as she offered the grain, then relaxed when the horse nuzzled her palm, made a soft, curious snort that sounded like approval, and Hazel laughed, a bright, surprised sound that fell over Grace like sunlight on cold stone. For months that laugh had been rare and fragile, and seeing it spill free made something in Grace unclench so slowly she startled at the relief. Royce showed the girl how to stand with the rhythm of a horse, how to move without startling, how to reach and stroke the long neck in a flat-handed slow way so the animal knew there was no hurry. He crouched beside her in the straw with a patience that had the shape of a teacher rather than a showman, and Hazel followed his hands and words with the solemn concentration of someone learning a spell. Grace watched from the porch, hands folded around a tin cup of cooling coffee, and she found herself studying Royce as much as the mare, how he let her take the lead, how he used soft, short sentences, How his voice thinned when Hazel stumbled over a command and then grew thick with delight when the mare accepted her touch. Those small mercies, repeated, were building a scaffolding around a child whose world had been flattened by fear. After a morning of careful instruction, Hazel moved to the grooming bench and took up a brush with both small hands, her fingers clumsy at first but gradually finding rhythm. The mare leaned into the brushing, eyes half closed, and Hazel giggled when the brush caught a stubborn knot and sent a soft cloud of dust into the sunlight, and the sound was like a bell chiming, unexpected, clear, and impossible to ignore. Royce stood near, not correcting her strokes so much as guiding them with a hand at her elbow when necessary, and Grace could see the way his jaw loosened when the child laughed, a relaxation that told her the man had found room in himself for a warmth he had perhaps buried. She felt, too, the odd ache that comes from watching good things form, joy at the return of Hazel's mirth, and a slow, wary hope that this happiness might hold. After the mare was brushed and fed, Royce led Hazel to a small fence where a group of scrappy colts stamped and kicked at the mud. He showed the girl how to move so the colts would not be frightened, how to keep her voice low and her hands empty. And when one bold little colt came forward to sniff her sleeve, Hazel squealed with a pleasure that seemed to surprise her as much as it did Grace. They spent the day in small, golden rituals, Hazel learning to tie a simple lead, Royce showing her how to hold the rope so it would not choke the animal, and Grace moving between the porch and the yard, an invisible seam mending with each small repair of laughter and taut touch. At midday they sat in the shade and Royce brought out a tin of apples he had traded for, slicing them into thin rounds for Hazel to share with the horses. She passed the pieces around, careful and proud, and each hum of thanks she received from the animals, an affectionate nip, a soft nicker, pushed a little more color into her cheeks. Grace found herself talking softly with Royce for the first time about trivial things, what seed to plant in the far row, which calf needed deworming, and the ease of the conversation was not the loud certainty of new lovers but a steady, building companionship that felt more honest and therefore more frightening. That afternoon, when Hazel climbed the swing Royce had set up under the beam and kicked her feet high enough that dirt flung like confetti, Grace realized that a piece of childhood had been found and put back in place, that a life had begun to stitch itself together with ordinary threads, oats and brushes, apples and small lessons. She watched her daughter laugh until she was breathless and felt an answering laugh well up inside her, soft and wet with tears, because the thing she feared most, the hollowing of her child, was filling again under a sky that had once only promised storms. The day closed on a simple supper, and as they washed dishes together by lamplight, Hazel hummed a tune she had made up about a horse who could sing. Royce's smile came slow and private, and Grace tucked the sound of it into a corner of her heart where, for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to dream of mornings like this being ordinary. Grace had risen before the sun that morning, stirring the stove to life with the slow, practiced motions of a woman who had spent years making something out of nothing. And while Hazel played with a small cornhusk doll by the hearth, Grace took to tidying the cabin with the same quiet diligence she carried everywhere. She swept, folded blankets, straightened the table, and when she knelt to tuck a stray quilt under the bed frame, her fingers brushed against a wooden box shoved halfway beneath the mattress. Curiosity tugged at her, not the nosiness of a thief, but the instinct of a woman learning the corners of a place where she desperately hoped to belong. So she slid the box free and lifted the lid, finding a jumble of ranch ledgers inside, their pages bent, ink smudged, and columns slanting sideways like drunken fence posts in a hard wind. She sat on the floor with the box in her lap, flipping through page after page of Royce's handwriting, numbers crossed out, recalculated, then crossed again, some totals hanging in the margins without explanation. It was chaos, honest but costly, and she felt a familiar itch in her fingers to set things right. Hazel looked up from the hearth and asked what Mama was doing, and Grace pressed a finger to her lips with a smile, hushing not the child, but the quiet thrill of slipping back into a skill she had once been proud of. She fetched a stub of pencil from her bag and began to rewrite the columns with swift precision, sorting inventory, balancing accounts, circling the tobacco supplier who had clearly overcharged Royce the previous month. Numbers had always obeyed her in a way life never had, and as she worked, the tension in her shoulders eased, her mind falling into the smooth order of arithmetic, the comfort of clarity. By the time Royce returned from the pasture, boots muddy and hair wind-stirred, Grace had arrayed the corrected ledgers neatly on the table, unaware of how intimate an act it was to polish the private workings of a man's livelihood. Royce stepped inside, brushing dust from his coat, and stopped in the doorway when he saw her, head bent over the open books, pencil tapping lightly as she finished totaling the last row. He did not step closer at first. Instead, he stood as if watching a scene he had no right to interrupt. When he finally found his voice, it came low and startled. "You did all that?" Grace looked up, uncertain whether she had trespassed, but the expression on Royce's face washed away her worry, open astonishment, a kind of reverence reserved for witnessing skill rather than favor. She nodded, suddenly shy. "I used to keep books for a freight office back in Missouri," she said, smoothing her skirt as if the confession were too grand for her worn dress. "My husband, well, he was not good with numbers. Someone had to keep the accounts straight." Royce stepped closer, picked up one of the ledgers, and ran a thumb along her newly drawn columns as though touching precision itself. "I've been fighting these numbers for months," he murmured. "Didn't know half of what I was doing." Grace braced for the edge of pride she'd hurt another man, the defensive sting that followed being shown up, but Royce only exhaled a soft, almost grateful laugh. "Reckon I should have hired you before I ever tried running a ranch on my own." Grace felt warmth rise in her cheeks, not embarrassment but a tender, cautious bloom of being seen for something beyond struggle and survival. They talked then, about trade prices, about the cottonseed he'd bought too dear, about the winter wind that warped barn doors and bills alike, and for the first time their conversation moved without the weight of unspoken fears. Trust slipped between them quietly, not demanded or promised, but forming like early spring, slow, inevitable, and almost unnoticed until it warmed the air. Hazel tugged at Grace's sleeve, and when Grace lifted her daughter into her lap, Royce watched with a gaze that held something deeper than thanks, something steady and growing. In that small cabin, with ledgers newly balanced and silence resting soft between them, Grace realized she was no longer merely sheltering under a stranger's roof. She was becoming part of its structure, line by line, day by day. Someone had to keep the accounts straight. Royce stepped closer, picked up one of the ledgers, and ran a thumb along her newly drawn columns as though touching precision itself. "I've been fighting these numbers for months," he murmured. "Didn't know half of what I was doing." Grace braced for the edge of pride she'd hurt another man, the defensive sting that followed being shown up, but Royce only exhaled a soft, almost grateful laugh. "Reckon I should have hired you before I ever tried running a ranch on my own." Grace felt warmth rise in her cheeks, not embarrassment but a tender, cautious bloom of being seen for something beyond struggle and survival. They talked then, about trade prices, about the cottonseed he'd bought too dear, about the winter wind that warped barn doors and bills alike, and for the first time their conversation moved without the weight of unspoken fears. Trust slipped between them quietly, not demanded or promised, but forming like early spring, slow, inevitable, and almost unnoticed until it warmed the air. Hazel tugged at Grace's sleeve, and when Grace lifted her daughter into her lap, Royce watched with a gaze that held something deeper than thanks, something steady and growing. In that small cabin, with ledgers newly balanced and silence resting soft between them, Grace realized she was no longer merely sheltering under a stranger's roof. She was becoming part of its structure, line by line, day by day. While we catch our breath by this dusty road, go on and tip your hat to the last rodeo. Give this story a like and subscribe so you can ride with us again soon. All right then, let's get back on the trail. It happened in a single careless breath of motion. Hazel, all bright curiosity and trust, had wandered closer than anyone should to the gray stallion that had not yet been broken, the animal's eyes dark with a wildness that held equal parts fear and pride. And when the colt shifted and flung a hind leg out like a thrown rope, Tom folded into a sharp, audible snap. Royce moved before Grace could name the danger, a human hinge throwing himself between child and hoot with the reflexive, terrible decisiveness of a man who knew how to put his body where a life might be saved. The hoot struck his shoulder with a bone-deep thud that sent the air from his lungs and dust into both their faces, and he hit the dirt hard, rolled, and lay the length of a long breath as Hazel's scream cleaved the yard and Grace ran with nothing but the thin ferocity of a mother, In the span it took for her boots to pound the mash of earth, she felt 1,000 old winters rise in her chest. Fear, anger, agonized at the thought of losing the one person who had begun to anchor them. And when she reached him, she found Royce cradling his arm against his ribs, face blanching, jaw set against pain, and the thin line of blood that had started to darken at his shoulder like a secret geography. She did not ask how badly until she had already produced warm water and a boiled cloth, did not hesitate when his coat came off and the bruise showed itself like a bloom. Her hands moved with the knowledge of someone who had tended worse, fingers washing grit from the skin. Tincture supplied, linen pressed with precise, soothing pressure, though her pulse hammered like a trapped animal. Royce did not complain much. He rarely did, only grunted sometimes when she unwound the torn sleeve and found the deep purple darkening under the skin. And once, in a voice rough with pain, he managed a rueful half-smile that said he would bleed before he would let anything touch Hazel. Grace wanted to weep. Instead, she busied herself with the work of care because busy hands could keep whatever panic trembled beneath from spreading. And in the lamplight, the small barn room took on the look of a shrine. Ropes hung quiet against the wall, a single oil lamp pulling light across the cracked table, and Royce's shoulders, usually broad and steady as a gatepost, now bowed under the simple, human fragility of being hurt. She bound the wound with strips of clean linen, tied them in a knot firm but not tight, and tucked a hot flat stone beneath his back to ease the shock while Hazel hovered at the doorway, eyes wide with a grief that made her body small. "You should not have," Grace began, voice breaking on its own danger, but Royce cut her off with a soft sound that was almost apology and almost no promise at all. "Suppose someone's got to keep the girl safe," he said, and the claim held in it more than bravado. It held a settled, dangerous tenderness that frightened and warmed Grace in equal measure. When the initial shock eased, Royce's hand found Grace's, fingers clumsy and sure in the light, and for a long time they sat in companionable silence that needed no words. She smoothed his hair back from his brow, felt the damp of fever-starting sweat, and pressed a cool cloth to his forehead, though the lamp made her fingers tremble. The night stretched around them like a careful thing, and at one point Royce coughed, a small, private sound, and Hazel curled close, placing her small, warm hand on his chest as if she could steady the beat beneath. Grace tended him through the hours, cleaning and binding again as the swelling rose and fell, mixing bitter tinctures into a spoonful of coffee so he would take it. And each time he swallowed, she felt a small, fierce gratitude that kept the shape of someone sparing a life from vanishing. The danger had laid bare things they'd only half admitted in daylight, the fragility of faith, the cost of protection. And as Royce rested, breathing shallow and steady, Grace found herself speaking in an almost lost whisper of the things she would not say aloud. "Thank you. Please don't go. We need you here." The list of prayers a woman presses into the dark. When morning finally softened the edges of the night, Royce opened his eyes and looked at the two of them, the child and the woman who had nursed him, with hands both steady and shaking. And there was a quiet that felt like an answer. Pain had a way of showing a man's limits, but it also showed the depth of the promise he had made with his body. And Grace, pressing Hazel's small head to her shoulder, knew that whatever storms or men might come, there was now between them a debt not of coin but of blood and bread, a boot and bandage, an account written in the marrow that would bind them more tightly than any paper. They had been playing a game of make-believe where Dells were accused of crimes and pardoned by Hazel's solemn decree, and she spoke with the loose, unguarded chatter of a child who holds nothing back. So when she put a doll on its knees and said in a voice far too small for what it carried, "Reuben'll come find you if you tell on him," the name dropped into the room like a stone in a pond, sending ripples across faces that had tried to keep still. Grace's hand tightened on the ribbon she was securing in the thread of control she had been wrapping around her chest, great a fraction, tiny and immediate, while Royce, at the workbench with a strip of leather over his knee, throws with the same sudden, precise attention a man gives to the crack of a distant gunshot. Hazel went on, untroubled by the way air had shifted. "He said the land's his, and he would make folks listen. And he drinks with the sheriff and laughs at Mama when she hides the key." And the words tumbled out in a child's rough recounting of an old terror she'd learned to name in whispers, and Grace's face went as white as flour as all the careful silences she'd kept for months unspooled into a single bright thread. Royce set the leather down as if it had burned him and stepped closer, the carpentry in his hands becoming still as a held breath. He did not speak at first, because sometimes the first sound is the wrong shape of courage and could break what little ground they had won. So instead he folded his hands, jaw working behind a face that had been patient and now showed an edge of danger. "Reuben," he repeated in a low voice, not a question but a naming that tasted like iron. Grace's eyes met his, and in that glance there was a history of running and hiding that needed no retelling. She had chosen safety over explanation until now, and the child's slip had made the choice for her. She took a step toward Royce, not to beg but to anchor, and Hazel, sensing that she had turned something she did not understand into a great thing, patted the dog's head and asked if it should be given trust or tied to the fence. There was a horrible, small clarity in the way the name settled between them. This was not a dangerous stranger met on a road. This was kin-turned-predator, a man with a badge stamped by neighbors who believed him honest and who could carry paper and ink like a weapon. Royce's hands were steady as he folded that knowledge into his posture. The patience that had kept him from prying into Grace's past now hardened into resolve, and Grace felt the change like winter edging closer to a field. "How long has he been bothering you?" Royce asked, his voice soft as he crouched so his eyes were level with Hazel's. For children give away the shape of truth in the way they look at you when fear is small enough to be named. Hazel crossed her legs, thumb in her mouth for the instant, she thought, and then in the plain way of children she said things without the way Grace had learned to hide. About the wrench left on their porch one night, about a boot print on the pantry floor, about a laugh heard through the thin wall that made her tuck herself in the far corner until dawn. Each detail was a splinter of a past Grace had tried to sand down until it fit back into the world. Royce listened to all of it, face darkening with an understanding that did not leap to threats but measured the danger like a man measuring a fence line by eye. When Hazel finished, she scrambled into Grace's lap and hid like a small animal, and Grace buried her face in the child's hair and let out a sound that was equal parts sob and bark of laughter, an animal sound made when the body is relieved of shame but not yet of fear. Royce rose then, hands finding their belt in a way that was practical and not theatrical. He did not show off the old revolver yet, though its memory hung in the room like a hanger for a coat, for he knew that many battles were won by paperwork and witness rather than pistol alone. "You telling me this now," he said, slowly, "means he'll come. Folks like him don't take silence as an answer." Grace swallowed and nodded once, the motion small but complete, and the air between them filled with the kind of plans you make when you have to shield someone from harm. Watching the road, asking neighbors to look in, putting a name to a lie so the law cannot be fooled by a badge. The thing that hurt Grace most was that Hazel, without meaning to, had given voice to the thing she had carried like a stone in her pocket. The thing that comforted her most was that the man who had given and bred had become the man who measured that stone and decided where to set it down. Royce's jaw unclenched only a fraction as he promised, quietly, not to be a false guardian but an actual one. He would not let Reuben walk over the place he had made for a woman and a child, and Grace, feeling the brittle edges of her furies into something that might name itself hope, realized that the porch where her daughter played had become a small front line, and that the life she had tried to bury under dirt and miles now had an enemy ally and a defender with boots planted like stakes. The evening settled over the ranch with a slow, amber hush, the kind that softened the edges of the fences and stretched shadows long across the yard. But inside the cabin there was no softness left in Grace, not after Hazel's accidental confession, not after watching Royce go still as a stone when the name Reuben left the child's lips. She knew the moment had come, the one she'd run from across 2 states and through every sleepless mile abroad. And as Hazel drifted to sleep with her doll tucked tight to her chest, Grace sat by the stove twisting the hem of her sleeve between trembling fingers while Royce waited with the patience of a man who had learned that truth needed space to come out whole. She tried once, failed, swallowed, then tried again, and her voice came in a low, shaking spill of sound. Reuben Holloway was not just kin by marriage, he had been a shadow on the wall of her home long before her husband Matthew died, a man who mistook grief for opportunity and privilege for rightful claim. A man who wanted the land Matthew left to Hazel because it was rich with timber and water rights and because taking it meant taking control of the only family Grace had left. Royce did not move except for the slight tightening of the muscles along his jaw, the kind of movement you might miss if you had not already learned the quiet geography of his face, and Grace drew a breath like someone preparing to bleed. She told him how, After Matthew's funeral, Reuben began arriving uninvited, first with offers of help that tasted like threats, then with documents he insisted she sign, then with the sheriff beside him, a man who drank Reuben's whiskey and nodded at every lie as if it were truth. She told him how one night she'd found the pantry door open and Hazel shivering inside because Reuben had stood over her bed claiming he was just checking on the child, and Grace's voice broke when she said the words she had held in her stomach like stones. He said no one would believe me if I spoke against him, that the land was rightfully his, that I was just a widow with no sense and no proof. She pressed a shaking hand to her face, half ashamed, half desperate, and the memory of that night, the fire poker in her hand, the cold in Hazel's hair, the way Reuben's breath had filled the hall with a sour smell of victory, trembled in her voice like a wound reopening. Royce still did not speak. He did not rush to comfort or outrage, and his quietness made Grace feel seen rather than pitied. But when she finally looked up at him, something in his eyes had shifted. The softness she had known was still there, but layered now with something harder, deeper, a kind of tempered steel that did not need sharpening. It was not anger yet, but the shape anger takes before it is named, and Grace realized with a jolt that this man, this quiet, solid rancher who stitched her daughter's sleeve and slept in the barn so they could rest, had just rearranged the boundaries of his heart to include danger on her behalf. She continued because he had earned the fullness of her truth. She told him how she had packed what little she could carry after Reuben passed out drunk in her parlor, how she'd locked Hazel in the pantry for safety and fled under moonlight, how every mile since Missouri had felt borrowed, as if Reuben would ride out of the dark behind them at any moment. When she finished, she felt hollow and terrified, waiting for judgment or distance or disbelief, but Royce simply drew a slow breath that shook once at the end, then nodded, not a dismissal, not an approval, but a promise forming quietly in the air between them. "All right," he said, voice low, controlled, but thrumming with something fierce underneath. "That's enough for me to know." He didn't swear vengeance, didn't offer false reassurances. Instead, he reached for her trembling hands and steadied them as though bracing a fence post in a rising wind, and Grace realized his silence was not distance, it was readiness. Something had changed in him, deep and rooted, and though she feared what the future might drag across their threshold, she felt a truth rise warm in her chest. She was no longer running alone. Night settled over the Banner Ranch with a heaviness that felt less like darkness and more like a warning stretching its limbs across the land. The cottonwoods outside murmuring in a restless wind as if they already sensed a shift in the air. And when Hazel finally drifted into sleep with her doll clasped to her chest, Grace found herself standing in the quiet kitchen staring at the back of Royce's silhouette as he knelt beside the old cedar trunk at the foot of his bed. She had never seen him open it before, had assumed it held old closer tools, but when the lid creaked and lamplight spilled over the contents, she saw the unmistakable glint of metal, an aged revolver wrapped in oiled cloth, resting like a relic of a past he never spoke of. Royce lifted it with a care that felt reverent rather than eager, and the gravity in his eyes that this was not a weapon pulled out of anger but out of necessity, a last resort for a storm he could feel gathering long before it arrived. He didn't look back at her, though he surely knew she was there in the doorway, her hands gripping the wood frame as if steadying herself, and for several breaths she watched in silence as he laid the revolver across his thigh, unscrewed the cylinder, and began cleaning it with the slow, deliberate motions of someone who understood what it meant to take a life, and what it meant to protect one. Grace hadn't expected fear to feel like this, not the choking panic she remembered from Missouri, but a quiet, hollow ache, a trembling mix of sorrow and relief as she realized Royce was preparing for Reuben in a way she herself never could. She pressed a palm to her throat, the memory of Reuben's boots in Hazel's room scraping through her mind, and she thought of how far she had run only to see danger finally catching up to her at a place she had begun to think of as safe. Royce worked methodically, never rushing, checking each chamber, wiping away dust, oiling the barrel, his jaw set in that familiar line of patient determination. And Grace noticed how his hands didn't shake, how his breath held steady even as the lamplight flickered against his cheekbones, and she felt the strange, stabilizing truth that he wasn't preparing for violence, he was preparing for responsibility. When he finally slid 6 brass cartridges into the cylinder, each one clicking home with a muted finality, Grace felt her knees weaken and she leaned more fully against the doorway. He snapped the revolver shut with a practiced flick and wrapped it in his coat before settling it beside him on the bed as though it were simply another piece of gear for morning chores. Only then did he lift his eyes to hers, and the look he gave her made her breath hitch, a look not of bravado or a threat or even certainty, but of promise, quiet and enduring, the kind that asked for nothing but said everything. She stepped into the room without realizing she had moved, her bare feet whispering across the floorboards, and for a moment they simply stared at each other. Two people bound by fear of the same man but held together by something growing stronger than fear. "You don't have to," she began, voice breaking. But Royce shook his head once, slow and resolute, as though the idea of standing aside were foreign to him. "Grace," he said softly, "trouble's already on the road. Only question is whether we meet it standing or running." She swallowed, feeling the burn of tears she refused to let fall, and watched as he slid the revolver beneath his coat and hung it on the chair within reach, not flaunting it, not brandishing it, but acknowledging the simple truth that danger needed answering. And when she finally sat beside him, their shoulders barely touching, she felt the faint, grounding warmth of his presence, the steady rise and fall of his breath, the faint smell of gun oil and cedar, and the unspoken vow that even if Reuben came with paper, badge, or threat, he would not find Grace or Hazel alone. Outside, the wind scraped across the tin roof like a whisper of what was coming, but inside the cabin, in that narrow circle of lamplight, Grace felt, for the first time since fleeing Missouri, not safe, but protected. Spring settled over the Banner place with the quiet, steady insistence of something that had been promised all along. Frost retreated from the fence posts and the field softened into a color that could be called hope. And Grace noticed how the chores, sweeping, boiling, mending, no longer felt like a list to survive but like stitches in a cloth she was making for herself. The sound she had not known she kept, an easy hum that rose from her as she worked, surprised her the first morning she heard it. It threaded through the small rituals of the day as naturally as sunlight through the slats of the porch. Hazel, who had arrived to the world with hunger hollowing her cheeks and fear small and constant in her voice, began to bloom in the ordinary way children do when the ground under them is steady. She woke before dawn some mornings to race Royce to the barn. She learned how to tie a knot that would not slip, and she came in smelling of straw and horses and the broad, comforting smell of a place that would hold her. Royce watched these changes with the same quiet attention he paid to fences and water troughs, where once his gestures had been mainly practical, stacking wood, mending a wheel. He now found himself making room for small joys, building things that had no immediate use but great meaning. One afternoon he took down an old length of rope from the loft and, with a patience that had nothing to do with show, carved a simple seat from a scrap of weathered oak. He hung it from the beam on the porch where light pooled in the late afternoon, tucking the knot out of sight and testing the swing with a careful weight before calling Hazel. When the little girl climbed up and pushed off with both feet, she squealed in a way that made Grace's chest pinch with something like relief and grief braided together, and Royce stood at the barn door watching. The angle of his shoulders softened in a way that suggested the sight of the child's laugh was as nourishment to him as any bread. The yard filled with a new kind of music, Hazel's laughter, the creak of the swing, the distant lowing of a calf, sounds that announced daily life rather than danger, and Grace felt herself responding in ways she had not allowed for months. She planted a small row of beans by the fence, humming to the rows as if coaxing them awake. She mended a dress with careful, patient stitches rather than the rushed fixes of the road, and she started keeping track of small recipes that filled their table rather than only counting rations. In the evenings they ate together at the rough table. Meals were simple: cornbread, stewed beans, slices of smoked meat, but there was an ease to the sharing of them that tasted of belonging. Conversation softened into the comfortable give and take of people who trusted the other not to leave without cause. Royce spoke, occasionally, about the weather in which pasture needed rest, and Grace answered with small, domestic knowledge that surprised them both with its usefulness. Hazel began to bring simple offerings to the table, a handful of wildflowers, an extra roll she had saved, proud to present them to the two people who had made a roof into a home. The swing became more than a plaything. It was a marker of settled days. Royce would sometimes sit in the shade of the barn and watch Hazel pump her legs and then call to Grace in a way that asked nothing but meant everything. "Come see." And when she did, they both watched the child until the shadows lengthened and the porch light made the world small and safe. There were practicalities to be debated still, seed to buy, a loose board on the West Corral, but the urgency that had propelled them across miles of cold and mud softened into planning and the steady business of keeping life upright. In that softness, Grace discovered a courage of a different sort, the courage to hope. She allowed herself, in quiet moments, to imagine teaching Hazel to read from the little reader Royce had found in a trunk, to host a neighbor for coffee without the glance toward the road, to hang a scrap of curtain at the window because beauty had a right to be domestic too. When harvest came in small measure, they celebrated with a simple supper and laughter that did not sound like an edge. Grace stood on the porch and watched Royce carrying a crate of corn, dust motes dancing in the sun at his heels, and Hazel chasing a hen across the yard, and she pressed her palm to the weathered wood of the railing as if steadying herself to the good. For the first time since the road took them from Missouri, the idea of staying did not feel like a trap but like a choice, one they could make together, and that consideration, fragile and brave, took root like spring grass in thug dirt. While we catch our breath by this dusty road, go on and tip your hat to the last rodeo. Give this story a like, and subscribe so you can ride with us again soon. All right then, let's get back on the trail. The supper that night was a small thing. Beans warmed in a blackened skillet, cornbread split and passed, a jar of blackberry preserves open with a careful thumb, and they ate by the lamplight, the cabin breathing slow as dusk folded into the edges of the world. Hazel had been drowsy from a day full of horses and sunlight, and Grace had settled her between them with a spoon in hand, pressing small comforts into a child who had learned hunger like a lesson rather than a lack. Conversation drifted over the simple business of life, which fence board the horses had rubbed raw, whether the neighbor would accept a day's work for a sack of seed, which row of beans should be thudded first when the ground warmed, ordinary things that stitch a life together. And Grace felt the steadiness of it as if hearing a metronome after months of dissonance. Hazel's spoon slipped from a sleepy grip and she buried her face into Grace's arm, breaths slow and even. And while the two of them sat protected under the lamp's pool, she sighed and mumbled, that small child voice threading the room with something fragile and true. "Night, Papa." The syllable landed like a bell. The sound was so plain and accidental and yet carried a weight that made the table between them feel suddenly thinner. Grace froze, spoon paused mid-air, and felt the bright, sharp wedge of feeling she had practiced against for months. Surprise, a wild hope that felt almost like treason, and a sudden, hot fear of naming anything that might be taken. Royce watched her, eyes catching the lamplight, draw a line of slow consideration. He did not flinch, did not deny or correct the child, and in that stillness Grace felt the hush settle over them like a vow. Hazel drifted deeper into sleep and the single word dissolved into the quiet tick of the clock on the mantel, but it had opened something between the two adults, an unguarded place where words were dangerous and silence could be kind. The silence they chose was not avoidance, it was an offering, where a sharp correction might have clipped the fragile thing from the child's mouth and taught her to curl inward again. Their silence allowed a place to be given without ceremony. Grace had long kept her debts and her promises counted in acts, a loaf offered at the road, a mended sleeve, a night spent in a barn to let another sleep war. Yet hearing Hazel call him Papa was the shape of a promise that could not be tallied by work. It carried the same quiet authority as legal paper and the same tenderness as a hand on a fevered brow. When the lamp guttered and Royce rose to fetch a blanket, his movements were deliberate and exacting. His hands folded the wool and laid it across Hazel's shoulders with a gentleness that had the force of protection. Grace smoothed a stray curl from the child's forehead and felt the small, intimate closeness of the moment press like a hand against something she had kept locked for survival. Later, after Hazel slept and the lamplight burned steady, they sat with their shoulders almost touching, speaking in low tones as if to keep the fragile thing between them from quivering. Grace said the words first, soft as a confession, that Hazel had said it in her sleep, and Royce answered with a quiet that was not boastful but resolute. If she wanted to call him that, let her. Names, he said, matter to children. They give them ground. Grace, always wary of provoking Reuben in his paper, asked if naming might invite more danger, might give Reuben a sharper reason to come claiming what he thought he owned. Royce's face went hard for a moment at the thought, then settled into a calm that made her think of fence posts driven in straight against a wind. "Let him come," he said, and the words were not a dare but a promise. He would meet whatever came in defense of what they had. The rest of the night turned to quiet planning. Who might watch the road? Which neighbors to ask for an eye? What papers, if any, Grace might yet find? But under all the practical talk there lay a softer change. The child's name had shifted the map of their lives. Where once safety had meant distance and running, now safety could mean belonging, and Grace, who had kept the small fragile thing of hope wrapped and hidden for so long, felt it loosen in her chest. Perhaps the word had been spoken too soon, or perhaps exactly when it was needed. In the lamplight, with the moon climbing steady outside, she allowed herself, for the first time since the road and the broken wagon, to imagine a night when Hazel would call a man father and mean it and be safe in the calling. The morning had started with the easy rhythm of chores. Hazel gathering eggs with her small, proud hands and Grace sweeping the porch while Royce checked the west fence. But as the sun climbed, a thin line of dust rose on the horizon, cutting across the open plain like a warning. And the moment Royce lifted his gaze, he knew the road was no longer empty. The lone rider came fast and sure. A man who rode as though the land itself ooded in passage, and Grace felt her breath lock in her chest the instant she recognized the posture, the arrogance, the way the reins were held like a leash. Reuben Holloway. He dismounted with a practiced swing, boots striking the dirt with the confidence of someone who believed consequence was meant for other men. Pinned to his coat was a gleaming badge, court-appointed custodian of estate and minor ward, and he tapped it once with 2 fingers as if blessing himself with its authority before he spoke. "I'm here for the girl," he said, his voice slick with certainty, "and whatever else your little runaway widow's been hiding." Grace pulled Hazel behind her instinctively, but before Reuben could take a step closer, Royce moved forward with a quiet, solid finality, planting himself between them like a post driven into hard ground. "You're not taking anything from here," he said, voice low and steady as a drawn line. Reuben laughed, a sharp, ugly sound that made Hazel bury her face against Grace's skirt. "You planning to stop me?" he asked, hand drifting toward the revolver at his hip, not yet drawing but promising he could. "I've got the law behind me. She kidnapped a minor, fled the state, and that land belongs to the girl, which means she belongs to me." Grace's knees weakened, but Royce didn't waver. He stepped forward until he and Reuben stood nearly chest to chest, the air between them vibrating with a tension that felt like the moment before a storm breaks. "Turn around," Royce said softly. "Right off." "I'm asking once." Reuben's smirk faltered, replaced by something colder, meaner. He shifted his coat, exposing the butt of his gun, and Grace's heartbeat roared in her ears as the yard franked to the space between 2 men. Then, hoofbeats. 3 riders crested the rise behind the barn, moving with deliberate purpose. Elijah Tinsley, old but sharp-eyed, Mara's brother from the general store, and young Thomas Gentry with his rifle slung across his saddle. They rode in slow, forming a half-circle behind Royce as if answering a call none of them needed spoken. Elijah spat into the dirt. "Banner," he drawled, never looking away from Reuben. "That man, haven't you trouble?" Reuben's posture changed, shoulders stiffening, hand dropping from his holster as his odds shifted from certain victory to the uncomfortable math of being outnumbered. Royce didn't look back at the men, didn't need to. "Her and the girl are under my roof," he said, still watching Reuben. "My name is Royce Banner. We were married last week. Hazel's my daughter by intent and law enough for these parts." Grace gasped softly behind him. Hazel clung tighter. Reuben's face twisted. "Liar," he spat, though uncertainty cracked through the word. "You've got no papers." "I've got witnesses," Royce answered, "and a woman who'd rather die than go back with you." The ranchers shifted, hands near their guns in a slow, meaningful gesture. Reuben looked from one to the next, calculating, but the math had already been done for him. After a long, tense breath, he swung onto his horse with a curse sharp enough to cut the air. "This isn't over," he snarled. "I'll be back with ink and iron." He wheeled his mount and rode off in a streak of dust. Only when he disappeared into the horizon did Grace's legs finally give, and Royce caught her before she fell, his arms steady, his voice low. "He won't touch you," he murmured. "Not while I'm breathing." The dust from Reuben's departure still hung in the air like the tail of a bad dream when the yard finally fell quiet again. The last echo of hoofbeats swallowed by the wide, watchful plains, and for a long moment no one moved, not Grace clutching Hazel against her chest, not the ranchers who lingered with rifles half lowered, not Royce standing like a man carved from the very land he swore to protect. The lie, if it could even be called that, still pulsed in the air between them, hot and trembling. "We were married last week." Grace had heard it, felt it strike her ribs like a thrown stone wrapped in something softer, something frighteningly close to hope, and now that Reuben was gone she could not seem to get enough breath, could not seem to loosen the tight knot that had formed beneath her collarbone. Elijah Tinsley tipped his hat, muttered something about keeping eyes on the road, and the others rode off one by one, leaving the yard strangely intimate in their wake, as if the whole world had narrowed to the space between Grace and the man who had just stated his name, his land, and possibly his life on a sentence spoken with more conviction than most wedding vows. Hazel tugged Grace's sleeve, whispering, "Mama, is he really Papa now?" But Grace could not answer, not yet, so she stroked Hazel's hair and sent her inside with the soft promise of warm water and a story. When the door closed behind the child, she finally lifted her gaze to Royce, who was rolling his shoulders as if settling a weight he had long expected. The revolver still hung under his coat, but his hands were steady, his breath slow, and when she stepped toward him, the dust curling around her skirts, her voice emerged in a thin, trembling thread. "You said we were married." She meant it as a question, an accusation, a heartbeat laid bare, but it sounded more like a confession twisted into words she didn't know how to shape. Royce wiped a smear of dirt from his jaw, looked at her with a quiet that held no apology, and answered in the same low tone he had used to face down a man with a badge. "That's the only part I didn't lie about." The world stilled. Grace felt her knees soften, her fingers go numb, because there it was, laid down as plainly as fence posts after a storm. He meant it. Not as a strategy, not as a bluff, but as truth he had carried long enough for it to feel like something already belonging to them both. She wanted to speak, wanted to tell him that she had spent months smothering any thought that resembled belonging, that the word married had become a wound she feared touching, that hearing him claim her before witnesses, real witnesses, had cracked something open inside her she hadn't realized was still alive. But all she managed was a whisper. "Royce, you shouldn't have had to." He stepped closer, shaking his head. "Grace, that man wasn't walking off this land with you or Hazel. Paper or no paper." His voice softened then, the edge of battle fading into something gentler. "But if claiming you kept you safe, then I'll claim you 100 times over." She breathed once, a shudder that felt like the first true breath since Missouri. And though neither of them reached for the other, though no vows were spoken and no rings exchanged, something rooted itself deep between them in that settling dust, something that felt an awful lot like a beginning. Not a lie, not a shield, but a promise waiting to be lived. The morning they rode into town was gentle and bright, the kind of morning that felt borrowed from a life Grace had never dared imagine. And as the wagon wheels hummed over the packed dirt road, Hazel perched between them, swinging her feet and humming as though the world had never held danger at all. Grace kept smoothing her skirt, her heart a nervous bird in her chest, while Royce held the reins with the calm steadiness of a man who had already made his choice and would not unmake it. They passed the general store, where Miss Mara waved from the porch, and then the blacksmith's shop, where the hammering paused as if even iron wanted to witness the moment, until the small chapel came into view, weathered wood, 6 pews, and a cross carved by a long-gone hand, quiet, humble, and waiting. Inside, Pastor Jim rose from his seat with a warm smile that softened the creases in his weathered face, and behind him stood 3 witnesses, Elijah Tinsley, hat in hand, Miss Mara, clutching a posy of wildflowers, and young Thomas Gentry, who seemed both nervous and honored to stand for such a thing. Grace's breath trembled as she stepped forward, Hazel holding tight to her fingers, but when she looked up and saw Royce watching her, not with possession, not with heroics, but with that steady, earnest devotion she had come to trust, the trembling eased into something warm and resolute. The ceremony was brief, spoken in low, reverent tones that seemed to settle into the very walls of the chapel. When Pastor Jim asked Royce if he took Grace to be his wife, Royce didn't even wait for the full question to finish. "I already do," he said, voice soft but certain, and Grace felt tears burn behind her eyes. When it was her turn, she looked at the man who had given her shelter when she was starving, who had taken a stallion's kick for her daughter, who had stood between her and danger without hesitation, and she whispered, "I do, with all I have left." The pastor closed his Bible gently, as though sealing something sacred, and though there were no rings to exchange, Royce took Grace's hands in both of his, rough thumbs brushing over her knuckles in a va outwards. Outside, the sunlight spilled across the chapel steps, warm and golden, and Hazel skipped ahead, twirling the ends of her dress. Royce crouched down, the wood creaking beneath his boots, and when Hazel turned to look at him, he spoke with a softness Grace had rarely heard in a man. "Hazel," he said, steady and gentle, "I know I ain't your blood, but from this day on, I ain't to be more than that. If it's all right with you, I'd like to call you my daughter." For a moment Hazel just blinked at him, the breeze tugging a curl across her forehead, and then she flung herself into his arms with such fierce, unthinking love that Grace felt the breath leave her. Royce closed his eyes and held the little girl tight, one hand cupping the back of her head as if cradling something precious and fragile. Grace watched them, her new husband and her child, bound not by necessity but by choice, and in that moment the long road from Missouri felt like a chapter finally closed. Here, under the wide Texas sky, they were no longer running, they were beginning. The night after the wedding, when Hazel slept curled like a kitten at the foot of their bed and the fire burned low enough to paint only soft gold along the cabin walls, Royce sat at the table with a sheet of paper, an ink bottle, and the quiet determination of a man who understood that some battles were fought not with bullets but with words written steady and true. He dipped the quill, breathed once, and began the slow, deliberate work of committing this promise to ink, declaring under sworn testimony that Grace Holloway, now Grace Banner, and her daughter Hazel lived lawfully beneath his roof in protection, that he claimed full guardianship of Hazel Banner by marriage and intent, and that he stood ready to defend her rights and safety with every means afforded to him as a citizen of the county. His handwriting wasn't elegant, some letters leaning like tired fence posts, but every stroke carried weight, and Grace watched from the doorway, hands clasped beneath her chin, overwhelmed by the quiet dignity of a man laying down the law for love rather than land. When he signed his name, Royce T. Banner, with a firmness that made the quill scratch loud in the hush, Grace felt something inside her unclench that had been tight since Missouri. Weeks passed, and the days moved with the rhythm of new belonging. Hazel's reading lessons on the porch, Grace humming as she kneaded bread, Royce tending wheat fields that finally looked like they might bear something worth harvesting. One late morning Elijah Dinsley's boy rode up fast, waving a sealed envelope and shouting Royce's name. Grace's heart slammed against her ribs as Royce broke the seal with his thumb, eyes scanning the page once, then again, breath leaving him in a slow exhale. "The court dismissed Reuben's claim," he said, voice steady but softer than she had ever heard it. "No contest." Grace covered her mouth as tears spilled over her fingers, silent, shaking relief that dropped her to her knees until Royce caught her, lifting her into his arms as she sobbed against his shoulder, Hazel hugging her legs, asking softly if the bad man was gone for good. "He won't trouble you again," Royce whispered, and it wasn't bravado, it was fact, signed and sealed. 2 days later, as if marking the end of all their running, Royce hammered a handmade sign above the ranch gate, carved from oak and sanded smooth by his own hands. The letters, though slightly uneven, stood proud, Banner and family. Grace traced each letter with her fingertips, Hazel danced beneath it, and Royce stood with his arm around his wife, looking at the land not as a lonely stretch of Texas, but as a place that now held 3 hearts instead of 1. When harvest came, a modest but honest yield, they set a long table outside beneath the cottonwoods, lanterns swinging in the warm dusk. Grace served cornbread and roasted vegetables, Hazel chattered about her letters, and Royce carved the meat with the easy contentment of a man who finally had someone to carve it for. As the last of the meal settled into quiet, Grace reached across the table, taking his hand, her voice trembling with the truth she had carried since that first desperate night beneath the broken wagon. "You gave me bread," she whispered, eyes shining in the lantern light. "But you also gave me home." Royce's fingers tightened around hers, steady and sure, and Hazel, half asleep against his coat, murmured, "Night, Papa," as the wind rustled the wheat fields of the life they had built together. If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again. Hit subscribe and help keep these old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matters. So till we meet again, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past and your heart pointed west.